All right, let me jump straight into this because there is simply no polite way of easing into it. See, every time you raise an eyebrow online, just an eyebrow, about some mainstream story, suddenly a little box pops up telling you, fact check, this is false. Yep, that thing. And it always arrives with the same energy, like a kindergarten teacher, virtually. Sweetie, you're confused. Don't think, we think for you. And for a while you might have let it slide, because it looks harmless, even helpful. I mean, who doesn't like the idea of a truth referee, right? Except the moment you look behind the curtain, you realize these referees aren't neutral, not even close. They're sitting on NATO's payroll. They're wired into governments. They're tangled up with big tech like a power strip full of overloaded stereotypes. And they're not checking facts, they're checking you. So today I thought I'd walk you through how this whole thing actually works, step by step, layer by layer. Because once you see the architecture, once you see the networks, the mandates, the funding lines, the whole independent fact checker thing collapses like a like a paper wall in a storm. And look, I'm not going to shout, I don't have to. The facts do the shouting all by themselves. The opening lie. We're independent. Let's start with that first big joke in the whole ecosystem, independence. You heard it everywhere. EU versus disinfo. It's actually a domain name. Atlantic Council's DFRLab, independent. Bellingcat, you might have heard it, independent investigative journalism, or so we think. Sure, independent in the same way my coffee machine is independent of electricity. Unplug it and you see what happens. EU versus disinfo was literally created by EU's foreign policy arm to counter Russian disinformation. Don't believe me? Well, that's from their own documents. DFRLab, born in the Atlantic Council, which is basically a NATO think tank in a suit. And Bellingcat, funded by the NED, which everyone knows or should know is the CIA's respectable cousin. The one that wears a tie and calls the same work democracy promotion. But it's worth to have a closer look at NED, because this thing pops up everywhere and nobody ever explains what it actually is or who they are. The National Endowment for Democracy. Sounds benign, right? Sounds like something that hands out cupcakes on elections. But here's the real story. The NED was set up in the early 80s to do openly the kind of political influence work the CIA used to do behind closed doors. That's not me being dramatic, that's literally how former NED officials described it. Democracy promotion, that's on their label, and regime engineering or regime change in the ingredients list. So what exactly does NED do? Well, it funds journalists, NGOs, opposition groups, media outlets, and yes, surprise, fact checkers. Anyone who can help shape the political landscape in the direction Washington wants it to be. Convenient how that works. And when you see Bellingcat or some independent watchdog proudly announcing they are funded by the NED, you already know the subtext. They're part of the soft power ecosystem, the velvet glove version of foreign policy. Think of NED as a polite, well-groomed cousin of the CIA. It doesn't kick down doors, it rewires the narrative. So right from the start, you have those so-called fact-checkers being incubated, funded, mentored, and supervised by Western governments and military alliances. It's not even subtle. They're not even umpires. They're players pretending to be umpires, while holding NATO season tickets and wearing their jersey under the uniform. Next, NATO's cognitive warfare program, the part nobody was supposed to read. That's the juicy stuff, the doctrine. Because NATO actually wrote down in their own public documents that civilian minds are now the new battlefield. I kid you not. I've reported about NATO's cognitive warfare program in the past. Let me repeat that in spoken English. Your mind is the new battlefield. Your beliefs, your perceptions, your emotions, your ability to evaluate what's in front of your face. NATO calls this the human domain. Their words, not mine. But they go even further. They describe the brain as the weapon and the target, which is wonderful when you think about it. The military alliance defending democracy now views your mind as a territory to be shaped, softened, and fortified against, dangerous ideas. Like skepticism, or critical thought, or remembering that Iraq weapons of mass destruction were just made up. So fact checkers, they aren't something separate from this whole propaganda machine. They're part of it. They're like the PR wing of a psychological influence program. They soften the ground. They disinfect undesirable thoughts. They sanitize the narrative terrain. But they never market it at all. And they wrap it all in protecting democracy and building resilience. Great words, totally empty, like political incense. And if you want to have a perfect example how that works, just look at Israel's Esther project. This was an Israeli government-run influence operation that paid lifestyle influencers, I'm talking up to 150 grants a month, to push Israeli narrative between makeup tutorials and iced latte reviews. No briefing rooms, no press conference. Just a TikTok creator doing a smoky-eyed routine, then boom, a geopolitical talking point slipped in like a free sample. You scroll, you nod, you move on. And you don't even notice the psychological operation sitting right there between bronze tips and morning skincare. That's the model. That's cognitive warfare. Clean, deniable, friendly. And NATO states watched it like it was a masterclass. Because once you can sneak a war narrative into the same feed where someone is rating their favorite coffee in Paris, you don't need tanks. You don't need speeches. You just need access to a ring light and a YouTube sponsorship voice. And this is exactly why the fact-checker ecosystem plugs into NATO doctrine so perfectly. It's not about truth. It's about shaping perception before you even realize perception is being shaped. The Esther project just made the invisible visible for a moment. If you want the full details about this embarrassing affair, embarrassing for Israel, you can watch it on YouTube or read the full expose on my Substack. Links are in the description. But remember, this is just a little glitch in the matrix showing how governments, alliances, and their media partners weaponize the everyday noise in your feed. If propaganda can hide inside latte talk and mascara tips, the cognitive war is already in full swing, and most people have absolutely no idea they're even in it. So what can we do to best investigate this public-private propaganda syndicate? Well, follow the money. Because follow the money, that's exactly what you have to do if you want to understand anything in the West. And here's where things get almost comical. The EU funnels millions to StratCom. The Atlantic Council gets fat donation from the US State Department and the UK government. Facebook gave DFRLab $1 million and direct internal access to the platform. Bellingcat gets NED money. Graphika and Moonshot do contract work for the Pentagon. If you don't know them, it's worth to check them out. Graphika and Moonshot. And a whole bunch of them hang out at the same conferences, sit on the same advisory boards, and hire the same ex-spies. And look, I'm not saying money automatically corrupts. But when you're financed by the same government whose narratives you're supposed to independently verify, that's nothing more than brand propaganda. So how does this fact-checking script actually work? Let's have a look at the linguistic assembly line. First, let's look at the output, because this might be my favorite part. If you analyze the language, and I did, you'll notice something. These fact-checkers use the same phrases, the same patterns, the same narrative formulas over and over again. For EU versus disinformation, everything is always a reoccurring pro-Kremlin narrative. Literally, thousands of entries stamped with the same rubber phrase. If you disagree with NATO policy, pro-Kremlin narrative. If you question a Western intelligence claim, pro-Kremlin narrative. If you dare to ask, hey, why did this fact-checker get funded by the NED? Boom, pro-Kremlin narrative. It's magical. A rhetorical disinfectant spray. Anything they don't like suddenly glows like a mushroom in Chernobyl. And notice the structure. Because they don't refute first, they attack first. Misinformation, baseless, conspiracy theory, distortion. Only after they prime you emotionally, they offer the facts. This isn't fact-checking, it's a classic framing. They're not clarifying truth, they're managing your perception. It's the linguistic version of putting your finger on a scale before weighing the fish. And we know all of this not only thanks to their publicly available information, but because sometimes they get caught. Not too often because journalists are terrified of calling them out, of course, but when it happens, oh boy. EU versus disinfo, for example, not so long ago labeled 3 mainstream Dutch outlets as fake news. Real newspapers, with editors, with legal departments. And the Dutch said, oh, wait a second, no, we are suing you. Suddenly EU versus disinformation did the digital equivalent of hiding evidence under the carpet, deleted the entries, issued a soft apology, and pretended nothing happened. DFRLab, they gave Twitter a list of 40,000 what they called disinformation accounts. Twitter checked, almost all of them were real humans. No bots, no troll farms, just ordinary people with opinions the Atlantic Council didn't approve of. Imagine for a second being falsely labeled a foreign influencer because you tweeted something outside the approved narrative window. And nobody apologizes. Nobody corrects the record. They just moved on. Like an assembly line of mistakes buried under PR statements. Why can they do that? And why will it get much worse in the future? Well, because Trump just last month equated dissent with terrorism. Yes, you heard me right. Trump has criminalized your beliefs with his National Security Presidential Memorandum number 7. Do you understand what that really means? Do you understand just how serious this is? For those who do, I wrote a full expose on this. Check it out, links in the description. Now, what's the psychology behind how they engineer your beliefs? And this part is crucial, because none of this works unless they understand how your mind works. And they do very well. They use inoculation theory, tiny doses of fake news to build resistance. They use nudges, warnings, prompts, little psychological pushes. They use emotional framing, fear, disgust, tribal identity. They even use pre-bunking, which is basically preemptive propaganda, planting seeds before the enemy narrative appears. And they justify all of this by saying, we are protecting you. That sounds so noble. But again, think about what it really means. They have decided your belief system is something they can engineer, not something you own, something they calibrate. Like updating your phone's operating system, except they're updating your worldview. It's the friendliest form of manipulation you'll ever encounter. A velvet glove performing brain maintenance. And of course, they're not doing alone. In come the big tech platforms, the automated censorship machines. Now, this is where it all comes together. Because these fact-checkers don't just write the reports. They don't just push articles. They actually feed the platforms like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, TikTok, you name it. Once a fact-checker slaps a label on something or someone, platforms downrank it, bury it, demonetize it, delete it, automatically. No charge, no trial, no appeal, no oversight. And through so-called trusted flagger programs. Operations like DFRLab literally sends lists of accounts to be censored. Not posts, accounts, entire voices. This is like a supermarket where NATO chooses what you're allowed to see in the shelves. This is also where we get to the heart of the matter. Because truth, real truth, doesn't come from one authority. It emerges from debates, from friction, from disagreement, from being wrong publicly. But the fact-checker network kills that. It hands down truth like a decree. Anyone who steps outside the line is branded misinformation, pro-Kremlin, or extremist adjacent. Academics get smeared, journalists get sidelined, platforms get pressured. Take Piers Robertson, who I've interviewed just a couple of weeks ago, a respected academic. He digs into Syria. He digs into the OPCW whistleblower scandal. Suddenly he's pro-Assad, conspiracy theorist, Russian adjacent. No debate, no engagement, just labeling and exile. This is how epistemic monopolies work. They punish deviation and they reward compliance. And they call it defending democracy. Of course. And here's the irony. The people telling you what's true and false are not scientists, not journalists, not philosophers. They're PR contractors. This is something you really have to understand. Government affiliates, think tank alumni, and intelligence community dropouts with LinkedIn profiles full of strategic communication buzzwords. And they've built a system where disagreeing with them is treated as a threat. Now even a terror threat. Remember Trump's memorandum. This is epistemic feudalism. Truth handed down from the castle, and your only job is to accept it and say, thank you. Look, the worst thing isn't censorship. It's not even manipulation. The worst thing is when people stop asking questions altogether. Because once that happens, they've already won. The whole point of cognitive warfare is not to convince you. It's to exhaust you. To make questions feel pointless. To make skepticism feel dangerous, which it is. To make conformity feel safe. And that's the real victory condition. When you censor yourself. And fact-checkers, with their friendly language and scientific branding, are just another chain that keeps you in what I call the velvet cage. I was recently invited to speak in Cork, that's in Ireland, to discuss the velvet cage, and I have discussed it with Pascal Lothers from Neutrality Studies. Both links in the description. So let me wrap this up in the bluntest way possible. Fact-checkers are not neutral. They are not guardians of truth. They are soft power instruments in a cognitive war targeting the Western public. Their job is not to enlighten you, it's to align you, to shape your perception of conflicts, enemies, allies, and narratives, to maintain the boundaries of acceptable speech. And the more power we give them, through platforms, laws, social pressure, the smaller our democratic space becomes. Truth doesn't need guardians. Truth needs sunlight, debate, collisions, trial and error. Freedom to be wrong, freedom to challenge, freedom to doubt. Because once we hand this over to a NATO-aligned fact-checker network, we're no longer citizens. We're consumer of certified truth. And that's not a democracy. That's a religion with fact-checkers as the new priesthood. Now, for those who made it this far, I have a little treat. Next Tuesday, that's November the 25th, I will publish a piece about the action movie Heads of State. I will show you that this light-hearted summer movie is nothing but a NATO propaganda piece. The actual analysis, the corporate connections, the fundings, the links in the background, the sources, it's all there. Check it out on YouTube for a clip like this one, or read the full expose on Substack. Alright, if anything of this made something click for you, or even just nudged you into thinking, the long-form breakdown is sitting on my Substack. That's where I can actually unpack the whole thing, the receipts, the connection, the sources, the money trails, all the stuff that doesn't fit into a YouTube video like this one. So if you're curious if your attention span hasn't been completely dissolved by vertical videos and dopamine trips, go check it out. It's all there, no filters, no restraints. And hey, if this video gave you something, then the usual ritual helps a lot. Subscribe, hit like, drop a comment, paste it on someone else's timeline. It genuinely makes a difference, especially for channels like this one that spends half their time buried under algorithmic shadow banning. But seriously, entirely up to you. Take from it what you need. I'm wrapping up. Catch you in the next one, but remember, always look beyond the headlines. Over and out.